بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح، تنهدى يا صاحي كي تستريح، وبث الدعاء الخفي الصريح، يسعك الفضاء الرحيب الفسيح. سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح، تنهدى يا صاحي كي تستريح، وبث الدعاء الخفي الصريح، يسعك الفضاء الرحيب الفسيح.
نحمده ونصلي على رسول الكريم أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome back to part 3 of our series of lectures looking at British Deobandi view on assimilation, integration, hatred, extremism and terrorism. If you have watched the first 2 parts, then you'll know that we have made some way through our lecture, and if you haven't, I would suggest you watch them first. And we've made our way across to political legal jurisdictions, which is where I left you off. We will hopefully explore further in terms of, once the theory is done, is what is Britain then, how do the Deobandi Muslims perceive Britain to be, the concept of citizenship, the rights, and eventually reach to a conclusion. Just to remind you what the lecture research is based upon, and also just to remind you again the various definitions that we looked at through the part 1 in particular. In part 2 we moved on to the Sharia, the Islamic law, and we went through that, and eventually we started to discuss at great length the role of context and how it plays a part within fiqh and how we can see the different rulings being established. We then moved on to the political legal jurisdictions, and that's where we will take up our discussion now. First area that we want to explore is Darul Islam. Now, we must bear in mind that the resources that are available to Muslim scholars are those which are somewhat dated now, centuries old, in which it was a very black and white world, in which there were groups of people sort of pitted against other groups of people. Arguably some would say these things haven't changed. One can say now it's more grey world now. There are sort of, complications which never existed. The us and them philosophy was much easier centuries ago than it is now. We kind of live in sort of confused or confusing situations where we can have a particular religious identity, we can have a particular national identity, and trying to juggle those identities can somewhat be challenging. But we will use what we have in order to be able to explore this area. And before we move on to what is Britain, what ruling do the Deobandi ulama give to Britain, we need to look at what is available. So let's look at the 2 or 3 that are available. And the first one is Darul Islam. Now, what is Darul Islam? Well, Darul Islam is, as we've defined it so far, a Muslim majority. And when I mean by majority, I mean by power. A Muslim majority state. And it means that this is about a country in which the citizens and the individuals are happy and are already have pushed for, because it's very rare that a government can enforce itself on a people. There's always the people who bring that government in, so they want to live under these particular laws. And they choose, and in those circumstances they are obliged to obey all individual and community Islamic laws, because there are community Islamic laws that are not required from minority Muslims. For example, collecting the zakat and giving that zakat out, and numerous other examples as well. We do have in minority situations groups of people, charities that do that, but they don't enforce it, because if you recall, it's a moral code now. A person is encouraged to give zakat, but there's no way you can forcibly take zakat off the person, whereas there will be things put into place to ensure that people are adhering to the 5 pillars. They've got to be ready and willing to accept immigrants from Darul Harb, and I will explore Darul Harb later, so that these individuals can come in and be protected. And they should attempt to financially assist and support the poor and helpless Muslims in Darul Harb. So they will try to get finances across, they will try to come to some agreement with the Darul Harb and try to bring people over. And last but not least, they will make effort in further expanding Islamic influence beyond its borders. Now, if we're going to talk about the Sharia being applied, then this is arguably the only place where it can be applied. It can't be applied elsewhere. Anywhere else, it's a moral code. It's at the choosing of the people, because there's no way to enforce it, there's no way to bring it about, there's no social institutes, there's no infrastructure, there's no political and legal will. There is nothing there that will bring about the obeying of all individual and community Islamic laws. It just does not exist. We are free to choose how we dress. We are free, in Britain for instance, we are free to choose how we dress. We are free to eat what we want to eat. We are free to do what we want to do. We are not to abide by any laws apart from British laws. We won't be taken away to jail or end up in court for not praying Jummah Salah or things of that nature. But we will if we go through a red light, because it's a British law that is applied within the UK. So this is what we need to explore. So is Britain Dar Islam? Far from it. It's nothing of the sort. So there's going to be no fear amongst fellow British citizens who see that, as is perceived by the right wing, the kind of Islamification of the UK. There's nothing of the sort. These are just scaremongering and scare tactics of the extreme right in order to pit communities against one another, as I touched upon earlier. So when one becomes suspicious, then this builds hatred. From hatred comes extremism. From extremism comes acts of terrorism. And that's really what the fringe groups are trying to do, is pit communities against one another. So, can Britain be considered Darul Islam? Very much doubt it. It's nowhere near. And again, I don't want to go into too much detail, but because that question is going to be posed. But that it's not going to happen. It's not. This is not what it is. So we did touch upon Darul Harb. What's Darul Harb? Well, Darul Harb is the punishments and rulings of Islam are not applying. Okay, so there are nothing, it doesn't exist. There is no rulings at all, because it's Darul Harb. And Darul Harb is translated as an enemy state. And it's that state which is, and I said this was a black and white world, it is that state which is at war with a Muslim state. But days gone by, Muslims all stayed together in Muslim states, and non-Muslims all stayed together in non-Muslim states. They didn't sort of cohabit together, they didn't live together, they didn't decide to live in the same land, because they didn't get on. And the governance and the social views in those days was that you just stick to your own and that's it. The world has changed. The mass migration of Muslims in the 20th century and since, and even now we see with what's going on in Syria, there's much migration coming from the east towards the west, and I can't see that stopping. So that's how so we see many Muslim minorities now living within states which are considered originally as non-Muslim majority states and continue to be so. What happens within Darul Harb? Well, Darul Harb is this enemy state, and it's necessary to migrate. Why? Because Islamic law and Islamic identity is virtually non-existent within Darul Harb. The Muslims are forced by law, by power, by coercion to adopt non-Muslim ways. And if they choose not to, then they are killed or locked up. They don't have a choice. Okay? And therefore, this is a situation where we will bring about migration, where Muslims will decide that we don't feel safe here and we need to migrate. So again, it's a reaction. It's a reaction to the position the state adopts. And the Muslim is outside the remit of the legislators, and therefore there is very little that differentiates the Muslim from the non-Muslim. In essence, what we're seeing here is forced assimilation. So forced assimilation puts the situation of that country in a very different ruling, and it makes the situation very difficult for those individuals who decide to live there. They have two choices. Choice one is to migrate. But those who choose not to migrate, they will isolate. And we have seen examples of that in the past, where communities cannot obviously migrate from that area, and as a result they adopt an isolationist attitude. There is a third option, Dar al-Sulh, Muada, Muahada, very much the same. And this third situation is very different, okay? And it's another one which sits in between. We had the original position of assimilation, isolation, and we had integration, which sat in the middle, and we have another one which sits in the middle here, Dar al-Sulh, Dar al-Muada, Dar al-Muahada, or anything which was to that effect. Here, again, there are no Islamic punishments, there's no Islamic law, and there's no qisas. So this is basically Islamic law. So there is no Islamic law. It doesn't mean there's a moral code. It means there's no Islamic law. But the dealings between Muslims and Dar al-Salam and other citizens cannot be settled in the courts of Dar al-Islam, meaning they can't take them to there because these are dealings which are taking place outside the country. But now, again, I say Dar al-Islam, where is that? What is that? It was a binary world days gone by. It's not a binary world anymore, so where would this person go? Again, this is further complicated by the concept of nationalism, and also further complicated by the fact that there aren't many, if any, countries that actually apply Islamic law within Muslim states. So, these are somewhat academic now. It is not necessary upon the Muslim citizens to emigrate from Dar al-Sulh. Why? Because he's not being forced to assimilate. He's not being forced to give up his religion. He's not being forced to give up his practices. He's allowed, he's appreciated, he's respected for his religion as is for his way of life, as long as he comes and she comes together for the common good. It is permissible to defend these lands and assist non-Muslims, like in the manner the companions assisted the Abyssinian king Najashi against his enemies. However, in terms of an offensive war, Muslims should avoid being involved if it is unjust, especially with the condition that is not to the detriment of a Muslim state. Because defending is a different thing. When it comes to defending the lands, because Muslims have now and do live with non-Muslims within a land, to defend that land together, there is an absolute requirement to do so, because by defending that land, they are defending themselves, they're defending their own children, they're defending their own estates and properties. And as they've decided to live in this particular country, they obviously will defend that country as well. And we've seen examples of that. However, when it's an offensive war, okay, Muslims should avoid being involved if it is unjust. Then what do we mean by an unjust war? Is going in there in order to take resources from this country, in order to change, regime change, in order to exploit, where people are being killed, wanton killing, bombs being dropped on hospitals and young children. Then obviously they should avoid that, because a Muslim can't kill anybody else. They can only kill when there's been an injustice done. How can they be the instruments of injustice when they are there to protect and to safeguard justice? And this is even more so further exacerbated with the issue that this has to be not a detriment to a Muslim state, because when a Muslim is killing somebody else, then there's some permissibility when there's an absolute need to, but then when it's at killing another Muslim, then one has to obviously think twice why they would go as far as that. Not saying that there hasn't within history Muslims killed Muslims, of course there has, and that started very early on within the Muslim historical history rather. So it can happen, but these are just again a position. So you kind of see that this is a very integrative, a very integrated a policy. It shows respect from the receiving country, and it shows the mutual respect coming from the recipient, migrant as in the Muslim. And I know I've said migrant one or two times, but most Muslims now that find themselves within the UK, and particularly in Britain, are obviously second or third generation born within the UK, so they are actually British citizens, and they don't hold citizenship to any other country. So their citizenship is very much so to this country. Next we touch upon the next area of is Darul Sulh, is they will not be excused like was living in Darul Harb of not knowing the Sharia rulings and dealings, meaning that they still need to know the rules, the body of rules. They are not excused from the body of rules, so they are expected to adhere to the body of rules. Well, why should they? They're British citizens, they can do what they like. Well, yes, they are British citizens, but they also chose a particular faith. Now, when they chose a particular faith, which is the faith of Islam, then, as I've mentioned before, that necessitated, that brought about also the view that they had to accept a certain moral code. And when they accept that particular moral code, then they will also have to bear in mind that that moral code brings about these rulings. And they're not excused from these rulings in Darul Sulh, that they will have to act upon them. But the difference is that they can't be implemented or enforced. That's the difference. So they will have to abide by the moral code. And here's, the Muslim couple from Darul Sulh, Dar Islam, even the curse separation is not necessary. And we see here in Darul Sulh, due to the promise of living in peace and security, then their non-Muslim lives and wealth are inviolable, and the use of un-Islamic practices of dealing in usury or trading in alcohol, swine or carrying or gambling in order to gain wealth are also impermissible. Now, we saw in Darul Harb that the law ceased to exist. But not only did the law cease to exist, we also saw that the moral code arguably ceased to exist. And there was certain, in fact you could say, certain practices which were no longer considered sinful. Whereas in Darul Sulh, there is this promise of living in peace and security. Muslims have peace and security living in Britain. They are safe and secure. The police, the fire brigade, the army, any area, the legal system won't treat them any differently because they happen to be Muslim. They will not treat them any differently. They will treat them equally. In fact, there's laws in place to protect that from happening. Yes, we can argue that there's not enough laws, or the laws don't go far enough. And with Islamophobia on the rise, Muslims, those people and those issues that Muslims hold daily are daily under attack. Whether it's the Prophet ﷺ and individuals deciding to attempt to mock him, whether it's particular religious practices which are being mocked, whatever it is, there are people who poke fun at Muslims, laugh at Muslims more than they do at any other. And this is no different than the Jewish community, or the start of the troubles against the Jewish community going back 60, 70, 80 years. And it looks like Europe still hasn't learnt its lesson, and we're kind of walking down the same road as we did decades ago. And you would have thought that that experience would have been enough to not make the same mistake twice. It looks like, some of that is already starting to happen now. But the legal system, when it's in place, does ensure peace and security for the Muslim. Because it does that, that makes it clear that this individual can actually practice his moral code. He's not being stopped from practicing his moral code. He can't practice his law because there's no judicial system, there's no legal system within the country, there's no authority within the country to enforce those Muslim laws. But there is this peace and security which will allow this individual to adhere to his own Islamic identity, and as a result he can't deal in those things which are normally illegal in Darul Islam. He's not allowed to engage with those activities whatsoever. So here we can see that Britain seems to be, on the face of it, without jumping the gun a little bit, falling into this category, that it seems to be this one, and it seems that this is an integrated, nice place that we can end up. But before I do jump the gun, I do want to look at what is Britain. Okay, where does Britain sit in? Now, for Britain, the Meccan period is very interesting. And the Meccan period is very interesting is because the Muslims lived as a minority. Question which comes up, is that period abrogated? Some would argue that Islam is progressive, or Islam was progressive rather, that when Islam originally within Mecca, Then when Islam moved to Medina with the migration of the Prophet ﷺ, and certain laws came in, then the laws which took place within Mecca were no longer relevant. In fact, certain verses had completely wiped those occurrences, wiped those situations, wiped those behaviors completely away. Now there is, as I understand it, some element of truth in that. What we mean by that is, we can't go back to Meccan times and say, well, okay, there's no fasting, there's no Hajj, there's hardly anything left now, because the main drive for the Prophet ﷺ and his companions in Mecca was to establish the oneness of God, to establish the oneness of Allah, Tawheed. And that was the key push, because it was a paradigm shift, it was a culture change. And as we know, culture changes take considerable amount of time. And when we overcomplicate cultural changes by adding lots of other things to it, we lose the whole aim, and we kind of get lost in our way. So there was a particular focus on that. However, can we really remove the social arrangement between the Prophet ﷺ and those around him? Can we really ignore and say that that no longer is relevant in the circumstances Muslims find themselves in the minority? Can we now say that that's of no use whatsoever? Can we really put 10 years of interaction between the Prophet ﷺ and the Meccans and say that we can learn nothing from that? I don't think we can say that. And we have to also bear in mind that the views of the ulama are based in their historic and geographical situation. I'm not at all saying that we can reinvent the madhab or anything else. That's not what I'm saying, and I want to go on the record for saying that in case my statement or my slide is taken out of context. What I'm saying here is particularly I'm talking about the Meccan period here, and about the view that the Meccan period is no longer relevant. Now, if I was a scholar in Baghdad, 1,000 years ago, and I saw the way the Muslim world was growing in strength, and I could see its borders growing on the east towards Europe, and I could see its borders growing towards the west, towards China, and north up towards and beyond the Caucasus, and south down towards India and beyond. I would never in a million years think that the Meccan period would ever be relevant again. I would think that's something for the books of history. That was a time for the Prophet ﷺ, that was his seerah, and that was something that he was involved in, and that's it. And it's no longer of any use whatsoever. Ask that same question to scholars now in 2016. Would they say the same thing? No, because we now find ourselves in a circumstance where the Medina period doesn't really assist us, because in the Medinian period the Prophet ﷺ was in a Muslim majority situation, whereas in the Meccan period he was in a minority context, and quite an aggressive non-Muslim majority against him, and as a result he was in those situations. So what do we say? So what I'm trying to sort of lean the view towards is the fact that this is an area which we can draw on, the Meccan period, to be able to answer social interaction queries. I'm not talking about practices of faith, I'm not talking about practices of worship, I'm not talking about any of those things whatsoever. I'm not talking about removing laws which have come about now, that came about within Medina. I'm not talking about anything whatsoever there. And again, I'm repeating myself and going on the record, because sometimes folk have a habit of taking something you say and misquoting you or taking out of context. What I am saying is that the social interactions which took place there can be used as a basis for scholars, not for non-scholars, for scholars to be able to see how we can best fit and continue to live within a minority situation. Also, particularly the Hanafi approach, and Imam Tahawi specifically, take a more reconciliatory approach, and whenever there's conflicting situations, then rather than abrogating, they try to take the context into consideration, and as a result try to act on both. So what I'm trying to argue here is that if we say that the Medina period abrogated the Meccan period completely, then we are sort of doing away with 10 years worth of social interaction. We're losing, and the Prophet ﷺ was a prophet, or declared as a prophet on the surface of the earth for 22 years, 10 months, or 23 years approximately. Now if we lose that first sort of 12 years or so, if we lose that time, and we're only left with 10 years or so, then we've lost the bulk of his social interactions compared to what was left. And also what we lose is the particular 10 years after, it was state building. And it was his work as a statesman and as a general, as an individual building an empire. And we don't find ourselves in those circumstances. We find ourselves in very different circumstances. We find ourselves in the circumstances the Prophet ﷺ found himself in during Mecca. Also key to bear in mind is the unique nature of the Quran in terms of its mode of revelation. We notice that in all the other books that were revealed, they were revealed all in one go. There was no revelation which took place over a period of time. And there's reasons for that, and again, I can't elaborate on all of these points that I'm making, and there's, I'm sure, better lectures and books written by scholars on these topics which you can further research. But the reason, obviously, is the Quran was the last revealed text, and being the last revealed text, it had to take into consideration situations as they were happening on the ground. Whereas for Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, for Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, for Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, it was a message which had to be brought and implemented immediately, because it was for a group of people who were steering away from the right path, from the true guided path. So it was revealed all in one go, and it said, right, this needs to be implemented, that's it. Whereas what we see with the Quran, which is unique, is that it's revealed over a period of time. In fact, we see this progressiveness. I use this word, and I've reclaimed this word, not the way the progressive is used now, but I'm using this word, and my definition is how the Sharia developed, so not making something illegal immediately, but allowing time for the social customs and the society to change with it. Also, revelation was coming, bearing in mind the context the Prophet ﷺ was finding himself in. And so therefore it would be relevant, and that whole argument of context plays a part again. Why? Why with Islam and not with the other religions? Simple answer. Islam is the final religion to be sent to the surface of the earth. It's the last one. And being the last one, it must be applicable in all circumstances and in all times to all people. For it to be that, there are times when Muslims are going to be in a majority, and there are times when Muslims are going to be in a minority. Muslims aren't always going to be in a majority state, and Muslims aren't always going to be in a minority state, but they're going to find themselves in anything from a virtual 0%, a country in which there's virtual 0% Muslims, all the way along the spectrum to a country in which they're virtually 100% Muslims, and everything else in between. They're going to find themselves in countries in which the state takes a very aggressive attitude towards their religion and challenges their identity and aims to remove their identity. They're going to end up in states in which there's assimilationist policies and ideologies in order to assimilate Muslims. And they're also going to end up in states where the states are more integrating, allow the Muslims as equal partners to integrate. And then there are going to be states in which the Muslims have political clout and power, in which they can establish Islamic law and everything else in between. That is a very relevant point. And again, if we dismiss this period, then what we are doing is we are losing an element of the unique nature of this Quran. We are losing this element to allow us, and again, I repeat myself, I'm not talking about ritual acts, I'm not talking about belief systems, I'm not talking about anything else. I'm referring specifically to social interactions that are founded within the Hanafi madhab. But the context is allowing a scholar to give fatwa on another opinion, on another view which exists within the madhab, and at times reaching out to other madhahib. I've already, we're on number 3 here of this series of lectures. I do not have time to explain that point that I just made to you about how the scholars will pass fatwa on a certain position and how other schools' views can be used. The next point is also that Muslims living as minorities after Hijrah. We saw that Muslims continue to live as minorities, that they didn't choose to make Hijrah. and they continue to live where they were. So we see, for example, Abyssinia, until the 7th of Hijri, the Battle of Khaybar, Muslims continue to live there. King Negus accepted Islam, uncertain when, but clearly he did, because of his funeral prayer, and that was sometime after. So you kind of see that Muslims were living in circumstances where they were minority. Yes, eventually the king accepts Islam, but we're not sure when he did that. But we know that obviously it happened. But there was a time, obviously, that Muslims could have travelled across back to Medina a lot earlier, obviously 7 years after Hijri. So they had 7 years to travel up to Medina. They chose not to. They continued to live for 7 years after the Prophet ﷺ had moved, because they were under no trouble. Yes, it could be argued that the king had accepted Islam, and as a result they were safe there. But you know, if you had the choice of moving somewhere else where there was a majority, because even that, in those circumstances, the Muslims would have been a minority, they would have been able to do so. So what examples do we have for Britain? Well, we've already given Mecca as an example, and we've elaborated that in great detail. Do we have anything else? Yes, there hasn't been always a us and them. There hasn't always been a black and white. There has been communities within China and the Far East very early on, from the time Islam appeared again on the surface of the earth. Very early on, and Muslims had migrated, Sahaba, and following on from the Sahaba, to far lands as merchants, as traders, as da'is, in order to spread the religion. And we saw pockets of Muslims living there, and not a concern. Where there was a concern is the so-called Mudijas in Spain, and this was after the Reconquista. And we saw, for example, the Umayyad dynasty, which had established itself in Islamic Spain, in Cordova, and those areas. We saw that they were living very well until obviously the Europeans the Catholics retook Spain, and when they did, the Muslims were left behind. And when they were particularly the Maliki madhab, and when they got their fatwa from the Maghrib, the North African scholars, saying what's our ruling, where do we stay, what do we do, they got mixed rulings back. Some scholars gave the view that it is compulsory upon you to make hijrah and return back to Africa, or return back to the Arab lands. Others said, well, in your circumstances, what you need to do is you can remove as much of your identity as a Muslim as possible, conceal your faith, because obviously the Europeans were hell-bent on destroying any Muslim they could find and kill him. So this was putting their life at risk, and we've seen that due to necessity, as we've touched upon the 3 reasons why a Muslim situation can change. One is necessity, and due to necessity, a person can even conceal their faith and apparently look and blend in with everybody else so as not to draw attention to himself. We carry on with this situation here, which is relevant to this study, is Muslims living as a political minority. Therefore, the issues that arise is how do Muslims remain true to their faith in the absence of a Muslim government? Similar to a society in the context where there are political majority, but the Muslim government does not apply Islamic law. So we can see, how do we answer this question? You know, you've got Muslims living now as minorities, and you know, every country virtually in the West now has Muslim minorities, and this percentage of Muslims living as a minority is growing. So I wouldn't be surprised if at least 40%, if no more than 40% now of Muslims are living as a minority. Yes, most Muslims live as a majority, but this is getting very close. And with the way the world is going, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if it's not long before 50% of Muslims are living as minorities and 50% as living as majorities. So how do we continue to remain true to our faith in the absence of Muslim government? Is it possible? Well, we seem to have given an indication that it is. Well, and hopefully we'll explore that further. Similar to a certain extent, in the country where there are political majority, the Muslim government does not apply Islamic law. What about that circumstances? They do live in a political majority. They do live in an area where Muslims are, inverted commas, in charge as Muslims. Now, that doesn't mean Muslims can't be in charge in non-Muslim states. Of course they can be charged, but they're not there because of their religion. They're there because of their social or political inclinations, I being a member of the Labour Party or being a member of the Conservative Party. What we're talking here is that a person is in charge based on their religion in order to implement their religion. Now, a key Hanafi text touches upon this very conundrum many years ago. That when there is no sultan or a person of authority in place, as is the case now in some Muslim lands, such as Cordoba, Valencia, and Abyssinia. And don't forget, even though it refers to as Muslim lands, we've got to bear in mind that Spain was obviously a non-Muslim land before the Umayyad dynasty sort of established themselves there. But Ibn Humam is referring to as Muslim lands, such as Cordoba, Valencia, and Abyssinia, where the reins of power are now in the hands of non-Muslims. So what happens with the Muslims living there? What does he say? He says, and the Muslims who have resided there under an agreement to pay a tax. So this is an agreement between the Muslims, citizens, and the non-Muslim government. Very similar to the situation we find within Britain now. Who have resided there under an agreement to pay a tax are responsible to choose a person to lead them. So basically a representative, somebody who would represent them to the government. The chosen person is to carry out the responsibility of a wali. He should either act as a judge or select another person to judge in order to settle the legal disputes among Muslims. Also, an imam should be appointed to lead the Friday congregation. Now here, this government is when governments and states did not interfere too much within the lives of their citizens. As I explained in one of the earlier episodes, the nation states now become very powerful. Their involvement now within each citizen's life is becoming more and more involved. And as a result, there is no way that Muslims would be able to set their own judge in order to settle legal disputes among Muslims, because they would not carry authority. But even if they did, this is clearly a case in where the reins of power are in the hands of non-Muslims. Now, if the reins of power are in the hands of non-Muslims, then what Ibn Humam is saying here is that the Sharia is not a law here, but rather it's a moral code, okay? It's actually a moral code, and they are free to choose whoever they wish in order to settle their disputes. Okay, so legal disputes can be settled if there's money problems, if there's inheritance problems, if there's issues where somebody's not getting on, or marriage issues, then these can be settled in these unofficial disputes amongst the Muslims themselves. So it's not an issue or a concern that's going on. Next we'll turn to is the concept of citizenship. But before we do, I think this will be the end of part 3, I'm trying to keep count. And we'll return again with part 4 in order to touch upon this point. I hope you can join me again. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.